On the last Saturday of April, in the year 1933, they sold the farm my husband is buried on. They sold it from the courthouse steps, in the rain, and I stood at the bottom of those steps and held the receipts for every single payment I had ever made on that note. 11 years of them. I did not cry. The man from the bank read the price out cold. The whole place, gone for $900. And when I looked at him, he looked back at me and said, "Sentiment doesn't pay a note." Mrs. Vance, 30 of my neighbors stood in the wet and heard him say it. Not one of them looked away. That night my son Elias spread 6 weeks of the county paper across the kitchen table. 6 weeks. And only 4 of them carried the notice of that sale. The next morning I walked to the post office and mailed a letter to the courthouse I never once thought I'd have cause to send. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before I go on, do one thing for me. Subscribe so the next story finds you, and leave me a comment telling me what town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let me tell it to you the way it happened, from the start. My name is Nora Vance. I was 52 years old that spring, and I farmed a quarter section on the Larkspur Ridge in Halvard County, Minnesota. 160 acres. Not rich land, but honest. It grew corn if the rain came, and hay if it didn't, and it grew both if you worked it like it owed you something. My husband Tom bought it in 1911 with a note from Farmers and Merchants Trust, and the two of us worked it together for as long as God let us. The influenza took Tom in the winter of 22. He was 50. One week he was pitching hay in the cold and the next he was gone, and I buried him up on the high ground at the east end of the property, under a bur oak that had been there longer than either of us. You could see the whole of the ridge from that spot. Tom used to stand up there in the evenings and look down over the corn and not say a word, and I always figured that was as close as a man like him ever got to praying. After he died, the note came due just the same. Grief does not stop a mortgage. There was $1,340 still owing on it, and every single month I carried $22 into the bank in Larkspur and set it on the counter and got my receipt. $22. Some months that was every spare cent I had, and some months it was more than I had. And I found it anyway. I sold eggs. I sold butter. I took in mending. Once I sold a good milk cow to make a payment and cried the whole walk home, but I made the payment. And I kept the receipts. Every one. My mother taught me that. She used to say a paper you can hold is worth 10 promises you can only remember, and she was right about most things. And she was right about that. I kept them in a tin box on the mantel, the kind that once held butter cookies. And by the spring of 33 that box was full to the lid with 11 years of little slips of paper, each one stamped and dated in the bank's own ink. I want you to know that I ran that place alone. I plowed alone. Tom's team was old by then, but they knew the work, and so did I. In the mornings I'd be out before the light, and in the evenings I'd come in after it. And my hands got hard and my back got strong. And I did not complain because there was no one to complain to and no point in it besides. My son Elias helped when he could. Elias came home from France in 1919 with a limp he'll carry to his grave. Bellow wood. He doesn't talk about it much, and when he does he talks about the mud and the noise and never about himself. He couldn't work the land after that, not the way it needs working, so he read law with a country lawyer in the county seat and clerked on a high stool copying deeds and wills in his neat hand. He believed in it, the law. He believed in it the way some men believe in a church. I used to think he believed in it a little too hard, like a man leaning his whole weight on a fence rail. But I never said so. Now, I'm going to tell you a small thing, and I want you to hold on to it, because it mattered more than anybody in this story could have guessed. In my pantry, behind the flour and the jars of beans, I kept a stack of newspapers. The County Sentinel, every issue, going back years. I saved them for the seed prices and the hog prices, so I could look back and see what corn brought in a given week. And plan against it. Tom started the habit, and I never broke it. Every Thursday when the paper came, I read it through, and then I set it on the stack in the pantry, in order, oldest at the bottom. It was just paper, just a habit. I thought no more of it than I thought of the wood in the woodbox. Now the spring of 33 was a hard one, and it was hard for everybody, not just me. The country was 3 years into a trouble it couldn't seem to climb out of. Corn was bringing next to nothing. Some men were burning it for heat because it was worth less than coal. Land that had been worth $90 an acre in the good years was worth a fraction of that, and half the farms in Halvard County had a note on them that was bigger than the land would bring at sale. Men who'd never missed a payment in their lives were falling behind, and the banks were calling the notes, and all up and down the county there were families being turned out onto the road. The bank in Larkspur was run by a man named Ansel Thorne. He was president of Farmers and Merchants Trust, and he was maybe 48 that year. A heavy, well-fed man who wore a good gray suit and kept his shoes clean even in mud season. He had a way of looking at a farmer like the farmer was a column of figures that hadn't added up. I'd stood in front of his counter 11 years, and I don't think he ever once said a kind word to me that wasn't oiled with something underneath it. For most of those years, when a man fell behind, the bank gave an extension. That was how it was done. A neighbor had a bad year, the bank carried him, and the man made it right when he could. It kept the county together. A bank that turned out every family that ran short would have had no county left to bank in, and everyone understood that, and so there was a kind of mercy in it, even from men who weren't merciful, because mercy was good business. But that spring, something changed in Ansel Thorne. I found out later what it was, and I'll tell you when I get there. But that spring he stopped carrying people. He started calling notes hard and fast, one farm after another, and folks couldn't understand it. Because it made no sense to take 100 farms nobody could farm and nobody could buy. The drought caught me first, the way it caught everyone. The corn came up thin and the rain stayed away, and by April I was a month behind for the first time in 11 years. One payment. $22 I did not have and could not get in time. I wasn't worried though, not really. I'd been faithful 11 years. I figured I'd walk in, explain it, and Thorne would carry me the way the bank carried everybody, and I'd catch it up when the eggs came good again. I figured wrong. Instead of an extension, I got a letter. It came in a stiff envelope with the bank's name printed in the corner, and it was 3 lines long, and it was cold as a well. It said my note was in default. It said the bank would proceed according to its rights. It did not say I'm sorry, and it did not say come in and we'll talk, and it did not say 11 years is worth something. It said default. That was the first time I felt afraid. I read it standing at the mailbox, and I read it again at the kitchen table, and the words did not get any warmer. I want to tell you about a thing I heard at the feed store right about then, because it turned out to be the whole hinge of everything. I was in for chicken feed, and there were 3 or 4 men around the stove talking low the way men do when the news is bad, and they were talking about a law. The state legislature, up in St. Paul, had passed something called the Farm Mortgage Relief Act, a moratorium. What it meant, one of them said, was that starting the first Monday of May, the courts could freeze farm foreclosures. Give a man time. Extend his right to redeem the property, so a family couldn't just be thrown off overnight for one bad year. The first Monday of May. The men said it like it was a rope thrown to a drowning county. And maybe it was. And then one of them lowered his voice more and said he'd heard Thorne down at the bank say the bank meant to settle its book before the politicians tied its hands. Settle its book. Before the first Monday of May. I didn't understand all of it then, standing there with a sack of feed on my hip, but I understood the shape of it. There was a date coming, and Ansel Thorne meant to get everything he could get before that date arrived. Keep that date in your mind. The first Monday of May. Everyone in this story is running toward it or away from it, and the ones who ran too fast are the ones who fell. It was maybe a week after the letter that a man came up my road in the middle of the morning. I didn't know him. He worked for the bank, or the sheriff, I was never sure which, and he had a hammer and a rolled paper under his arm, and he walked up to my barn without so much as a word to me and nailed the paper to the door. 4 strokes of the hammer, 1 in each corner. Then he touched his hat, which I have never forgiven him for, and got back in his truck and drove off. I walked out to the barn and read it. It was a notice of foreclosure sale. It said the property of Nora Vance, being the northeast quarter of section such and such, would be sold at public auction on the courthouse steps to satisfy the debt owed to Farmers and Merchants Trust. And it gave a date. Saturday, the 29th of April. I stood there in the barn lot and did the arithmetic in my head, and my hands went cold. The 29th of April was 9 days before the first Monday of May. 9 days before the law that would have saved me took hold. Ansel Thorne was going to sell my farm out from under me with 9 days to spare. I noticed one other thing, standing there, though I didn't know yet what it meant. The date on the notice, where the ink was heaviest, was smudged, blurred like someone had thumbed it before it dried, or printed it in a hurry. I remember thinking it was a careless piece of work for a thing that was going to end my life on that ridge. I didn't know then that the carelessness was the whole story. But I noticed it. I want you to know I noticed it. That evening Elias came out from town. He does that on Thursdays. Brings me the paper and sits a while, and he saw my face before he got both feet out of the automobile. I gave him the notice without a word. He read it at the kitchen table under the lamp, and I watched his lawyer's face go still and careful the way it does. Then he asked me a strange question. He asked me when I'd first seen this notice in the newspaper. I told him I never had. I said I'd have remembered seeing my own farm in the sale column, thank you. He looked at me a long moment. Then he said, Ma, a foreclosure sale can't just happen. There's a law about how it's done. The bank has to publish the notice in the county newspaper. Not once. It has to run once a week, every week, for 6 weeks running before they can sell. 6 successive weeks. That's the statute. I didn't follow him yet. I said, all right, 6 weeks, so what? He picked up the notice again and looked at the date the sale was set for, the 29th. And then he asked, real quiet, when did they first run this in the Sentinel? Neither of us knew. But we could find out. And that right there is where the whole thing turned, though we didn't feel it turn. It felt like nothing. It felt like a tired woman and her son at a kitchen table with a lamp between them. But that was the moment the ground shifted under Ansel Thorne, and he never heard a sound. Elias counted on his fingers, working backward from the 29th. 6 weeks. 6 successive weeks would mean the first notice had to have run in the middle of March, or earlier. He asked if I had my papers. And I said, of course I have my papers, they're in the pantry, and I got up and went and fetched a stack of them the last 2 months of the Sentinel and set them on the table. We started laying them out in order by their dates. And here is what we found. In the 6 weeks before that sale, the notice of the Vance foreclosure appeared in only 4 of them. 4 issues, not 6. And they weren't even the 6 weeks straight running. There was a gap. The first time my farm was ever printed in that paper for sale was only 28 days before the sale date. 4 weeks. The law said 6 successive weeks, and the bank had given 4. 2 weeks short. Elias sat back in his chair, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, they rushed it. To beat the moratorium. They started the clock too late, and they couldn't make 6 weeks fit before the first Monday of May, so they just didn't. They ran it 4 weeks and sold anyway, and figured nobody would count. And he looked at me across that table, and his eyes were bright in a way I hadn't seen since before France. But you count, Ma. You've counted $22 a month for 11 years. And you keep the papers. I want to be honest with you about what I did next, because it's the part I'm proudest of, and it's the part they laughed at. I did not go and shout. I did not go and beg. I did a small, plain thing. I sat down and I wrote a letter. I wrote it careful and clean. I said that I, Nora Vance, had reason to believe the notice of the sale of my property had been published only 4 weeks and not the 6 the law required, and that the sale set for the 29th of April was therefore premature and unlawful, and I asked that it be stopped. I wrote 1 copy to the bank and 1 copy to the sheriff. And I did not just mail them like ordinary letters that could vanish and never be admitted to. I walked them into the post office in Larkspur and I sent them registered, with a return receipt, so there would be a paper, stamped and dated, proving the bank got my words and got them before the sale. Old Ferris was the postmaster. He'd known me 30 years. He stamped the receipt and signed it as witness and looked at me over his spectacles and said, "You sure about this, Nora?" And I said I was sure. And I was. He put those letters in the bag himself. I found out later what became of my letter at the bank. Thorne's clerk opened it, read it, and laughed. He set it on the corner of the desk and said something like, "The widow's counting weeks." And that was all the answer I got. They threw it in a drawer. They did not stop the sale. They did not count. But here is the thing about a registered letter with a witnessed return receipt. It does not care whether they laugh at it. It only cares that it exists. And it existed. Stamped, dated, witnessed by Ferris. And the day would come when that little slip of paper would sit on a judge's bench and stop being funny for everybody. The sale came on the 29th. A Saturday. And it rained. I could have stayed home. Elias asked me to. He said, "Don't go, Ma. Don't stand there and let them do it in front of you." But I told him I would not hide in my own kitchen while they sold Tom's Ridge. I would stand where I could be seen. So I put on my good coat and my good hat and I rode into the county seat, and I stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps in the rain with the tin box of my receipts held against me under my coat, and I watched. And I want you to understand, I was not the only one who came. 30 of my neighbors came. Farmers off the Larkspur Ridge and out of the river bottoms, men I'd known my whole life and their wives, and they didn't come to buy. They came to stand. They stood along the walk and up the steps in the rain, silent, in their old coats, water running off their hat brims, and they looked at Ansel Thorne on those steps like a jury looking at a man they hadn't sentenced yet. Thorne presided over it himself. That's a thing I've never forgotten. He didn't send a clerk. He stood up on the courthouse steps under the little roof where it was dry, in his gray suit, with the auctioneer beside him and Roland Pike standing off to the side. Pike was Thorne's brother-in-law. I didn't know that then. I knew his face, but not the connection. He was maybe 40, a soft man who did a little of this and a little of that and never much of anything, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets looking at his shoes. The notice was read out loud. My farm, described in the dry words of the law, section and range and quarter. And then the auctioneer asked for bids. And the whole crowd of 30 stood there in the rain, and not one of them made a sound, because not one of them would bid against a widow for her own ground. There was just the rain on the stones and the water in the gutters. And then Roland Pike, looking at his shoes, raised one hand and said, 900. Nobody else said anything. How could they? The auctioneer called it once, twice, and knocked it down. $900. For a farm that was worth $3,000 if it was worth a cent, even in that ruined year. Sold to Roland Pike, who I would learn that very night was married to Ansel Thorne's sister. The bank had sold my farm to the bank's own family, cheap, in the rain, 9 days before the law came down. I climbed the steps then. I don't know what I meant to do. I think I just wanted him to have to look at me. And Ansel Thorne looked down at me from under his dry little roof, and he saw the tin box, because I'd taken it out from under my coat, and I was holding it in both hands in front of me like an offering. He knew what it was. 11 years of my receipts. And he said, loud enough for all 30 of them to hear, because he wanted them to hear, "The calendar belongs to the bank. Mrs. Vance, sentiment, doesn't pay a note." 30 of my neighbors heard him say it. And I'll tell you what I did. I did nothing. I did not cry, and I did not shout, and I did not curse him. though the Lord knows I wanted to. I stood there in the rain with my box of receipts and I looked at him until he looked away first. And then I turned around and walked back down the steps to my neighbors, and one of the women put her arm around me and we walked out into the rain together. He thought he'd won. He thought the calendar belonged to the bank. And that, right there, was the mistake that finished him, though it would take a while yet to show. Because a man who lives by the calendar had better be able to count, and Ansel Thorne could not count to 6. Now it would be easy to end the sad part there, and I know that's where most of these stories end. The bank wins, the widow weeps, the neighbors go home. But that is not where mine ended, and I promised you I'd tell it true, so stay with me, because now the ground begins to shift the other way. The sheriff came a few days later and nailed up a notice to quit. That meant I was to be off the place by a certain day, off Tom's Ridge, out of the house I'd carried on my back for 11 years. And that notice, cruel as it was, is what pushed me from grieving into fighting. Because that same night Elias came out again, and this time he didn't sit down easy. He said, "Ma, get all the papers. Every one you've got, I mean it." We spread them on the kitchen table under the lamp. Not just the last 2 months this time. He wanted 6 full weeks, so we went to the pantry and pulled the whole run of the Sentinel back through the middle of March, and we laid them out in a row across the table and across 2 chairs, in order, and we went through them one at a time looking for the notice of my sale. And it was just like before, only now we could see the whole of it. 6 weeks of papers on the table. And the notice of the Vance foreclosure appeared in 4 of them. 4. I had written the dates on each masthead myself in pencil over the years, out of habit, so there was no arguing which issue was which. The paper itself, in its own dated ink, said the bank had published 4 weeks. The law said 6 successive. The papers did not lie and could not be made to. Elias moved them around on the table with one finger, lining the 4 up against the empty weeks, and he started to laugh. Not a happy laugh, a hard one. He said, "They can't fix this. Ma, do you understand? This isn't your word against Thorne's word. This is the newspaper's own printed pages against Thorne. He can stand up and swear the sale was proper till he's blue. And here are the papers that say it wasn't, in black ink, dated in the county's own record. He rushed it and he left the proof in 100 pantries all over this county." Then he told me there was a second thing, and it was as bad for Thorne as the first. He said the law didn't just care that a sale was advertised right. It cared that a sale was fair. And a sale where the buyer turned out to be the banker's own brother-in-law, and the price was $900 for a $3,000 farm, was what the lawyers called self-dealing. The bank, through its own kin, buying cheap from itself. He said a sale like that, a sale that shocked the conscience, could be set aside by a court even without the newspaper problem. And I had both. I had the short publication and I had the straw buyer, and either one might undo the sale, and together they were a rope with 2 strands. Then he said the thing that changed how I stood up in my own kitchen. He said, "You're not going to go ask them for mercy, Ma. You already tried plain and honest, and they laughed at it. We're not going to beg. We're going to file a petition in the district court to set this sale aside as void under the statute. We're going to make the law that's supposed to protect them protect you." And I looked at all those papers on the table, my own pencil marks on the mastheads, 11 years of receipts in the tin box, the registered letters receipt with Ferris's signature, and I thought about Tom up on the ridge under the bur oak. And I said, "All right. We file." That is the decision. That is where a tired widow stopped grieving and started counting back at the man who told her sentiment doesn't pay a note. The next days we spent building what Elias called the file. He was precise about it, the way he is about everything. He said a court doesn't run on feeling, it runs on proof, and every claim has to have a paper standing under it. So we gathered the papers, one by one, and I'll tell you what went into that file because every single piece of it was going to matter. First, the 4 issues of the Sentinel, the ones that carried the notice, with the dates plain on the mastheads. Those proved 4 weeks. Then we set aside the other issues too, the empty weeks, because the absence proved as much as the presence. The gaps were evidence. Second, the return receipt from my registered letter, stamped and dated and signed by Ferris, proving I had warned the bank and the sheriff before the sale that the notice ran short. That one mattered in a way I didn't fully grasp yet. Elias said it took away any chance for Thorne to say it was an honest mistake nobody caught in time. I'd caught it. I'd told them in writing. They'd chosen to sell anyway. The receipt proved they knew. Third, the tin box. 11 years of payment receipts, every $22, stamped in the bank's own ink. Elias said those weren't strictly needed to void the sale, but he wanted them there anyway, because a court is made of men, and men should see that this was not a deadbeat who'd never paid. This was a woman who had paid faithfully for 11 years and fallen 1 month short in the worst year the country had ever seen. He said let them look at that box. Fourth, he went to the courthouse himself, to the Register of Deeds, and he found the recorded deed of the sale, the one that put my farm into Roland Pike's name. And right there in the public record it could be traced that Pike was married to Thorne's sister. The kinship was a matter of record, too. Everything the bank had done in a hurry, it had done on paper, and every one of those papers was now going to line up against it. Elias worked for a country lawyer named Amos Deck, and Mr. Deck was a careful man who did not love making enemies of banks, because a bank in a small county is a hard enemy to have. Elias took the whole file to him and laid it out on his desk and made the argument, and I went along and sat quiet, and I watched Mr. Deck's face while he went through the papers. He was slow about it. He held each issue of the Sentinel up to the window light and read the date. He looked a long time at the registered receipt with Ferris's name on it, and when he was done he took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes and said, "Well, the bank surely did step in it, didn't they?" And he agreed to sign the petition. He said he didn't expect to keep the bank's business after this. And he said it like a man setting something down he'd carried too long. He said, "But this is what the courts are for, or they're for nothing." So the petition was drawn up. It asked the district court to declare the foreclosure sale of the 29th of April void, because the notice had not been published for 6 successive weeks as the statute plainly required, and because the sale was tainted by self-dealing and a grossly inadequate price. It had my name on it, Nora Vance, petitioner, against Farmers and Merchants Trust and Ansel Thorne and Roland Pike. I held that petition in my hands the night before we filed it, and it was just a few pages of Elias's neat clerk's hand, but it felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried, heavier than the milk cans, heavier than the tin box, heavier than grief. Because I knew what it meant to file it. It meant I was done being quiet. It meant a woman who'd never in her life made trouble was about to walk into the courthouse where they'd sold her farm and hand the clerk a paper that said, in the coldest, plainest language the law would allow, that Ansel Thorne had broken the very law he thought he owned. And I knew he would not take it lying down. A man like that does not lose a farm he's already sold to his own family without fighting. And he had money and lawyers and the whole weight of the bank behind him, and all I had was a son with a limp, a country lawyer about to lose his best client, a tin box of receipts, and a stack of old newspapers I'd saved for the hog prices. But I had the papers. And the papers did not lie. And there was a date coming, the first Monday of May, and I was beginning to understand something Ansel Thorne had never once considered, standing dry on those courthouse steps telling me the calendar belonged to the bank. The calendar he was so afraid of, the law he ran so hard to beat. What if the very thing he raced to get ahead of was the thing that would circle back around and land on him? What if a man who cheats a deadline can be caught by it? I folded the petition and set it by the door for morning. And I did not sleep much that night. Because in the morning I was going to walk into that clerk's office, and once I handed that paper across the counter, there was no taking it back, and no telling which way it would fall. Morning came the way it always does, whether you slept or not. I put on my church dress. Not because it was Sunday, but because I wanted to walk in there looking like a woman who belonged in a courthouse and not a woman apologizing for coming. Elias drove me in. His limp was worse in the mornings, the cold settling into that leg the way it does, but he never said a word about it. He carried the file. I carried the petition, the few pages in his neat clerk's hand, folded once and held flat against my chest like something that might blow away. The clerk's office was a narrow room with a high counter and a smell of ink and old paper. A young man in sleeve garters looked up at me. I set the petition on the counter. My hand did not shake. I was surprised by that. I had expected it to shake. "I'd like to file this," I said. He read the caption. His eyebrows went up, just a little, and then he schooled them back down the way clerks do. He knew the name Thorne. Everybody in that county knew the name Thorne. He stamped the top page. He wrote the date and the hour in a ledger. He gave me a copy back. And that was all. That was the whole of it. No thunder, no trumpet. A rubber stamp and a boy's careful handwriting in a book. But I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, because I understood that the thing was done now. I had said out loud, in the coldest, plainest language the law allowed, that Ansel Thorne had broken his own rules. There was no calling it back. The paper was in the book, and the book belonged to the court, and the court did not belong to the bank no matter what he thought. Elias took my elbow going down the courthouse steps. The same steps. I did not look at the spot where the auctioneer had stood. I looked at my son's careful feet on the whetstone, and I thought, well, we have started something now. For a while after that, nothing happened, and the nothing was its own kind of torture. I went on the way I always had. I fed the hogs that were still mine to feed. I walked the fence line. I kept every receipt in the tin box on the mantel, because keeping receipts was a habit 11 years deep, and I was not about to stop it now that they mattered. I paid a call on the Hendricks place and one on the Sorensens, and I did not talk about the petition, and they did not ask, but I saw it in their faces. They knew. In a county that small, everybody knew by supper. Ansel Thorne knew too. And here is what I understood about him, though it took me a while to see it plain. He was not afraid. A man who is afraid moves careful. Thorne moved fast. He was so sure the widow could not fight him that he went ahead and tried to record Roland Pike's title before the ink on my petition was dry. He wanted the deed on the books, the land signed over, the whole thing sewn up so tight that no judge would want to unpick it. That was his answer to me. Speed, the same speed that had gotten him into this. Elias came out to the farm one evening with his face gray. He sat down at the kitchen table without taking his coat off, which was not like him. Thorne's lawyer filed a motion, he said, to dismiss. He says the petition's untimely. Says the sale's final and the time to object ran out. Did it? No, he rubbed his leg. No, it didn't. But that's not the worst of it. He looked at me then, and I have never seen my boy look so much like the day he came home from France, when he stood in the yard in his uniform and couldn't make his mouth work. Deck's out. Out how? The bank hired him, not our case. A whole slate of new business, corporate work, more money than a country lawyer sees in 5 years. Thorne's people went to him direct. Elias laughed, and it was an ugly sound. They bought him. They didn't beat us, Ma. They just bought the man who was going to sign our papers, and now there's a motion to dismiss on the docket and nobody licensed to stand up and answer it. I sat down across from him. Outside the bur oak was black against the last of the light, and under it Tom was sleeping, and I thought about how a man like Thorne had money enough to just reach out and take away the one lawyer in 3 counties who'd stood with us. You're licensed, I said. I'm a clerk. I passed the bar, but I've never argued a thing in my life. I read the law, I copy the papers. I've never stood up in front of a judge. He shook his head. This is Halverson's court. He's old, he's seen everything, he'll eat me alive. But you can stand up. Legally, you're allowed. He was quiet a long time. I'm allowed. Then you'll stand up." I put my hand flat on the table. "Elias, you came back from that war believing the law was supposed to work the same for a farmer as for a bank. You said the uniform never paid off, that they sent you to bleed in a French wood and you came home to clerk on a stool. Here it is. Here's the thing paying off. It's our farm, and it's my name on the paper, and it's your hand that wrote it. Who else should stand up but you?" He didn't answer, but he took the file home that night and he did not sleep either. I found out later. He read the statute until he could have said it in his sleep. He read every case Deck had left behind. He built the argument the way he used to build fence, post by post, each one set deep. The motion to dismiss came up on a Thursday. I sat in the back of the courtroom in my church dress and watched my son walk to the front on his bad leg. Thorne's lawyer was a smooth man from the city named Pruitt, in a suit that cost more than my note payment, and he stood up and talked for 10 minutes about finality and repose and the sanctity of completed sales, and he used a great many words, and I understood about half of them. Then Elias stood. He didn't have many words. He said, "Your Honor, the bank asks the court to throw this out without looking at it. But the petition doesn't ask the court to undo a good sale. It asks whether there was a sale at all. And that's a question about this court's own statute, whether the law the legislature wrote was followed in this county. I don't think a bank can buy that question out of the room." Judge Halverson was a big old man with white hair and a face like a plowed field. He looked down at Elias a long moment. Then he looked at Pruitt. "Mr. Pruitt, the young man's right about one thing. Whether my statute was obeyed is my business, not the bank's." Motion denied. "We'll hear the petition on the merits." He set the date. Then he added, dry as August, and Mr. Pruitt, tell your client a question of the court's own statute cannot be bought out of the room. He seems to have gotten the notion that it can. I did not cheer. You do not cheer in a courtroom. But something in my chest that had been clenched tight since April let go. Just a little, just enough to breathe. The hearing was set for a Tuesday, and the Tuesday came the way the filing morning had come, whether I was ready or not. I have never seen the courtroom so full. I thought maybe a handful would come, the Hendrickses and the Sorensens, and a few of the men who'd stood in the rain at the auction. But they came. All of them. The 30 who'd watched Thorne sell my farm off the steps, and more besides. Farmers I knew and farmers I only knew by their fences, in their good clothes, hats in their hands, filling the benches until men stood along the back wall. They didn't say much. They just came, and they sat, and they were a weight in that room you could feel. Solidarity is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It just refuses to leave. Thorne came in like he owned the building. 48 years old and comfortable in it, a heavy gold watch chain across his vest, Pruitt at his side. Roland Pike came behind them and sat apart, and I watched Pike the way Elias had told me to. He kept touching his collar. His eyes went around the room and did not land anywhere. A man with an easy title flip does not touch his collar like that. Judge Halverson took the bench and the room stood and sat. He put on his spectacles. He looked at the file a long time before he said a word. Thorne testified first. Pruitt walked him through it, smooth as butter. The note was in default. The bank had every right to foreclose. The sale was properly advertised, properly conducted, properly closed. Thorne said the words properly advertised, and I watched him say them, and there was not a flicker on his face. He believed it. Or he believed nobody could prove otherwise. He looked out at the room full of the farmers whose fields he held paper on, and there was that same contempt I'd seen on the steps. The certainty that the law was a tool that fit his hand. Then Elias stood up to cross-examine, and my heart went into my throat. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "you say the sale was properly advertised. The statute requires the notice to be published once each week for 6 successive weeks before the sale. 6 weeks. You're familiar with that requirement? Of course. And you're prepared to tell this court the notice for the Vance farm ran the full 6 weeks. It ran as required." That's not what I asked. Elias's voice was very quiet and very steady, and I did not recognize it, and I have never been prouder of a sound in my life. Did it run 6 successive weeks? Yes or no? Pruitt was up objecting, and Halvorsen waved him down, and Thorne said, I'd have to consult the bank's records. I have the records, Mr. Thorne, not the bank's. The newspapers. And here is where the pantry mattered. Here is where 11 years of me stacking the county Sentinel behind the flour and the bean jars, for the seed prices and the hog prices, for no reason but thrift and habit, here is where that plain small thrifty thing became the whole hinge of it. Elias laid the papers on the clerk's table one at a time. 4 issues of the Sentinel, each with the foreclosure notice on the legal page, each dated. And then he called the newspaper's own publisher, a nervous man named Holt, who'd printed that notice himself. Mr. Holt, when did the Vance notice first appear in your paper? Holt swallowed. He'd have rather been anywhere else. But he was under oath, and his own dated papers were sitting right there, and a man cannot argue with his own masthead. First insertion was the 4th week of March, and the sale was April 29th. Yes, from the 4th week of March to April 29th. Count it for the court, Mr. Holt. How many times did that notice run in your paper? Holt looked at the papers. He looked at Thorne. He looked back at the papers. 4 times, he said. 4 weeks. The room did not gasp. It was quieter than that. It was 30 farmers who had all been counting weeks their whole lives, weeks to planting, and weeks to harvest, and weeks to a note payment, understanding all at once that the bank had counted wrong, or counted right, and done it anyway. 4 weeks, Elias said, not 6. 28 days from first publication to sale. The law says 6 successive weeks, and the bank gave it 4. He set down the last paper. Now, why would a bank in the business of foreclosures, that does this a dozen times a year, that knows the statute cold, why would it cut the notice 2 weeks short? Pruitt objected. Halvorsen let it stand for argument. Elias reached into the file and brought out the deed. Because of the date, Your Honor. The sale was April 29th. The Farm Mortgage Relief Act took effect the first Monday of May, 9 days later. 9 days. If the bank had run the notice the full 6 weeks the way the law commands, the sale falls after the moratorium, and it's frozen, and the family gets the protection the legislature wrote. So the bank didn't run it 6 weeks, it ran it 4, and sold 9 days early to beat the calendar. He laid the deed flat. And here's who it sold to. The farm, 160 acres, a quarter section worth $3,000, went at that rushed sale for $900 to Roland Pike. And the deed records show. It's public. Anyone can look. That Roland Pike is Ansel Thorne's brother-in-law. The bank's president sold the widow's farm out from under the moratorium, 2 weeks short on the notice, to his own wife's brother for less than a third of what it's worth. He turned to face Thorne then. He didn't raise his voice at all. That was the terrible part. He said it as plain as a man reading a feed bill. The bank was in such a hurry to beat the law that it never once stopped to keep it. I have carried a great many things in my life. Milk cans and grief and 11 years of a note. I have never carried anything as light as I felt in that moment, watching my son lay it all out on that table, plain as the papers, and the papers did not lie. Judge Halvorsen took the file to his chambers and was gone the better part of an hour. Nobody left the room. The farmers sat. Thorne sat, and for the first time I saw him not sure of something. He kept his back straight, but his hand went once to his watch chain and then made itself be still. When Halvorsen came back, he had the statute book open in his hand, and he read from it. He read the plain words aloud, the way you'd read scripture, the once each week and the 6 successive weeks, and his old voice filled that room. Then he closed the book on his thumb and looked out over all of us. The law is not complicated here, he said. It says 6 weeks. It does not say 4, or 5, or as many as the bank finds convenient. 6 successive weeks, published, before a sale. This is not a technicality. This is the notice the law gives a family before it takes their home, so they have time to find the money, or find a buyer, or find a lawyer. The bank gave the Vance family 4 weeks. It gave them 2 weeks less than the law commands, and it did so on this record to conduct the sale before a state moratorium would have frozen it. He set the book down. A sale conducted in defiance of the statute conveys nothing. It is not a sale. It is a piece of paper. The foreclosure sale of the Vance quarter section, held April the 29th, is void. Void from the beginning. Title never passed. The deed to Mr. Pike is a nullity and will be stricken from the record. He looked at Thorne over his spectacles. And I will say one more thing for the record. A bank that shortens the notice to beat a law it doesn't like has not been clever. It has been lawless. The moratorium the bank raced to get ahead of is now in effect, which means this note is frozen under its terms, and this family's right of redemption is extended under its terms. The very law you hurried to escape, Mr. Thorne, now shelters the woman you tried to escape it with. That is not the court's doing. That is your own. I want to tell you what happened to each of their faces, because I watched, and because I had earned the watching. Thorne first. When Halverson said the word void, the color went out of him. Not all at once. It drained, the way it does from a man who's been struck but hasn't fallen yet. He was on his feet before Pruitt could stop him. Your Honor, this is a clerical matter, a printing error at the newspaper, the bank cannot be held, and his voice, which had read my farm off the steps so cold and so certain, cracked in the middle of it. That was the sound I'll remember. Not a shout, a crack. The composed contempt breaking open, and something small and scared showing through. Halverson just looked at him until he sat back down. It is not clerical, Mr. Thorne, it is jurisdictional. Sit down. Then Pike. Roland Pike had come in thinking he owned a farm he'd gotten for a song. When the judge said the deed was a nullity and would be stricken, Pike's easy title flip turned to ash right there on the bench in front of him. He didn't understand it all. I could see he didn't. But he understood he'd lost it. And worse. He understood that the deed with his name and Thorne's kinship on it was the second nail. The self-dealing the judge had named out loud in a full room. His $900 had bought him a lawsuit and a name in the county's mouth. He touched his collar one last time. Then he got up, quiet, and slipped out a side door before the judge had even finished. The way a man leaves who knows the rest of the conversation is not going to be about him and does not want to be there when it turns. And then there was a man I hadn't marked before, sitting near the front, plain suit, a leather folder on his knee. He'd been writing the whole time. When it was over, he came up the aisle and introduced himself to the clerk. And I heard the words State Banking Department and Examiner. Halvorson had said the self-dealing out loud and the defective sale out loud in open court on the record. And a bank that would shorten a notice and sell to kin on one farm had likely done it on others. The Examiner wanted the file. He wanted, I learned later, all the files. Every rushed foreclosure Farmers and Merchants Trust had pushed through in the weeks before the moratorium. The Hendrickses. The Sorensens. Half the men sitting in that room had lost or nearly lost a place that same spring, the same way, to the same haste. My one void ruling had opened a door, and 30 farmers were standing in it. The chorus. I have to tell you about the chorus. Because when Halverson struck the deed and said title never passed, those farmers who had sat so quiet, hats in their hands, they did not cheer either. But there was a sound. A long breath let out all together, 30 men and their wives exhaling at once, and then a low murmur, and then somebody in the back said, "There it is, just that, there it is." The way you'd say it watching rain finally come after a dry spell. They had stood in the wet and watched Thorne sell me out and say sentiment doesn't pay a note. Now they had stood again, in the dry, and watched the law say otherwise. That was the romance of it. Not a man and a woman. 30 neighbors who came and sat and would not leave, and a farm that came home because they bore witness twice. I did not gloat. There is no satisfaction in gloating, and I had never been made for it. When it was done, I stood up and I gathered my things. The receipts. In the tin box. The 4 folded papers. That was all I had brought, and all I took away. I put the box under my arm. Thorne was in the corridor. Pruitt had gone ahead, and the examiner had him half-cornered by the tall window, asking his quiet questions and writing the answers down, and Thorne was answering in a voice that had lost all its weather. He looked up, and he saw me coming. For one moment we looked at each other, the way we had on the steps in the rain, except everything under it had turned over. I had thought about what I'd say if this moment came. I'd thought about it plowing and thought about it feeding hogs and thought about it lying awake. And when it came, I found I only wanted to say one thing, and I said it plain, walking past, not stopping, the tin box under my arm. The calendar came back around. Mr. Thorne, that was all. I didn't wait to watch it land. I went out the courthouse door and down the same steps, and Elias came behind me on his bad leg, and the farmers came behind him, and we all went out into the daylight together. The Ridge is a different place in the honey light of a late October afternoon than it is in an April rain. I sit on the porch now with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I watch the low sun come across the quarter section, across ground I plowed myself this fall. The furrows running straight down toward the bur oak where Tom is. The note is current under the terms the moratorium gave me. $22 a month, the way it always was, only now the state stands between me and any man who'd try to rush me again. The deed is back in the tin box on the mantel, next to the 11 years of receipts. And the notice is in the box too. The foreclosure sale notice, the one a hired hand nailed to my barn door in the spring with the date smudged. I could have burned it. I thought about burning it, but I kept it, folded small, tucked in with the receipts and the deed. Because that piece of paper is the whole story. They nailed it to my barn to take my farm. They read it off the steps to sell my farm. And in the end it was that same paper, laid on the bench, that voided the sale and gave the farm back. The thing they used against me became the thing that undid them. I keep it to remember that. The instrument of the offense was the instrument of the undoing, and the difference between the two was only that somebody bothered to count the weeks. Elias reads at the kitchen table most evenings now. He's not a clerk anymore. 3 families hired him, the Hendrickses, the Sorensens, one more, to reopen their own rushed sales, and there'll be others before the examiner's done. He's got his own shingle in the county seat, small, 1 room, his name on the glass. His limp hasn't gone anywhere. The cold still finds it. But the war he came home from bitter, the uniform that never paid off, the law he thought would only ever serve the men who could buy it, it paid off. It paid off in a courtroom on a Tuesday, with his mother's pantry newspapers on the clerk's table. He found what he came home looking for. It was behind the flour the whole time. They tell me Ansel Thorne is not the president of Farmers and Merchants Trust anymore. The state took his book apart the way he should have taken it apart himself, week by week, one careful count at a time. And it did not like what it found on the other farms any better than it liked what it found on mine. And Roland Pike went back to selling what was his to sell, which was never my farm and never anybody's but his own. The law is a slow thing and a small thing. It is made of dates and weeks and the fine print on a legal page that nobody reads. It does not care who you are. It does not care that Ansel Thorne had a gold watch chain and I had a tin box. It only cares whether 6 weeks means 6 weeks. And here is the thing I learned that Thorne never once considered, standing dry on those steps telling me the calendar belonged to the bank, the law belongs to whoever bothers to read it. Not to whoever's richest, to whoever counts. I paid on time for 11 years and I kept every receipt, and I used to think that was my protection. It wasn't, not by itself. The receipts didn't save the farm. The old newspapers did. The ones I stacked out of habit and never meant for anything. The protection wasn't in being faithful. It was in keeping the record, in paying attention, in noticing when the powerful thought nobody was counting and counting anyway. So if you're a quiet person, and you've always figured the fine print was for other people, for the men in the good suits, I'd think again. Keep your papers. Count your weeks. The men who run hard to beat a deadline have a way of running straight into it. I've seen it. I've got it folded up in a tin box on my mantel. The sun's about down now. The oak's gone black against it the way it does. Tom's under there. And the ridge is mine, and I believe I'll finish this coffee cold. If you've been watching this one, tell me the name of your town in the comments. I'd like to know how far it traveled.